So here is what we're going to talk about with this subject. The traditional definition of who is a Jew for centuries, but as you'll see, not the whole time, is somebody born to a Jewish mother or somebody who converts to Judaism. But we'll see that was not always the case, and that has been challenged in recent years. Where does that come from? What is the origin of what is called the matrilineal principle? And where does conversion to Judaism come from? Because really, historically speaking, it doesn't exist in the Hebrew Bible. So that's going to be 2 or 3 talks. And then we're also going to talk about current disputes over conversion today in the United States and in Israel, where the subject of who is a Jew has been a very fraught issue. And finally, if time permits, we're going to talk about the question of can you lose your Jewishness? So, for example, if you convert to another Christian religion like Christianity or Islam, do you lose, according to Jewish law, your Jewish identity? It's not, none of this is straightforward, believe me. So let's start back in the times of the Bible. And we're going to start with the question of whether Jews, we'll call them, the term didn't exist then really, let's call them Israelites. Who were they allowed to marry? And what happened if they married a non-Israelite? What was the status of the children? So Dominica, if you could pull up on the screen the first sheet. It's the biblical sources on who is a Jew. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So the first, there are, let me just first start by saying there are a lot of Israelites, famous Israelites, who marry non-Israelites. For example, Moses. Moses marries a woman who's referred to in the Torah as a Midianite or an Ethiopian. And according to the Torah itself, the Israelites, when they left Egypt, left with what the Torah calls, in the English translation, a mixed multitude, meaning other people left with them who are not Israelites. In fact, there's a story in Leviticus chapter 24 about an Israelite who has an Egyptian father and an Israelite mother. He gets into a fight with another man, and in the course of the fight, he blasphemes God. He curses using the 4-letter word name of God called Jehovah. And in the book of Numbers, the Israelites have sex with a whole bunch of Moabite women, and one particular Israelite in public deliberately has sex with a Midianite woman. So there are Israelites having sexual relations with non-Israelites all over the Bible. I don't want to say they're the majority, but it's certainly present. So now let's look and see what the Torah has to say. It says specifically, this is the first source, you can't marry any of the 7 Canaanite nations in the land of Canaan. Do not give your daughters to their sons or to take their daughters for your sons. Why? The reason here is given because they will turn away. Well, actually, it says your son, but to make it more gender neutral, I translate it as your children from me to worship other gods. In other words, the concern is if the Israelites marry these non-Israelites, they will inevitably turn to idol worship and away from the belief in one God. This is also mentioned in the book of Exodus, and it's also mentioned in the book of Joshua once the Israelites reach the land of Israel. Again, the prohibition against intermarriage, specifically with the Canaanites, is mentioned. I want to go back to the end of the verse where it says, they will turn your son away from me to worship other gods. Why the son? Because in the biblical view, I mean, this is a patriarchal society, the concern is more about what happened to the men than what happened to the women. Why? Because it is really clear, despite what the rabbis would like to say, and we'll see what the rabbis do with this very verse, that it was the man who determined the religion or the nationality of the child and not the woman in biblical times. So that if a woman married out of the Israelite religion and nationality, and I just want to say, it's very difficult to know what to call the Israelites. And it's just like it's difficult to know what to call Jews. Are Jews a nation, a religion, or both? This is a subject that we will come back to over and over. Also mentioned I didn't print this verse, so I'm just going to summarize it. Also from the book of Deuteronomy, from chapter 23, verses 2-4, it says that neighboring peoples called the Ammonites and Moabites cannot come into the congregation. Egyptians and Edomites, another neighboring people, can come into the congregation, but only after 3 or 4 generations. What does that mean, to come into the congregation? It's not clear. The rabbis interpret that to mean that they can't marry Israelites. The Ammonites and Moabites, Egyptians and Edomites can't marry. Some interpreters in a later period, from the Second Temple period, means that they can't go into the temple in Jerusalem and participate in religious rites. But the rabbinic interpretation is that they can't marry. Now, what's the problem with that? Ruth, from the book of Ruth. She is a Moabite. She marries Israelites. We'll come back to the book of Ruth when we talk about conversion. So the Israelites, they're a group of Israelites, Elimelech and Naomi, who go to Moab because the neighboring land, because there's a famine in the land of Israel, and the sons marry Moabite women. One of them is Ruth. And here, again, we see patrilineal descent, right? Their children are considered, eventually, the children of Ruth are considered Israelites. But it seems to go against what's in the Torah, which is that you can't marry a Moabite woman. What's the problem? The lineage at the end of the book of Ruth traces her offspring to one of the most important Israelites of all time, King David. How can that be? The rabbis have an answer. Their answer is, it says a male Moabite and a male Ammonite cannot marry, not a female. So Ruth was okay. Now, is that the original meaning of the verse? Probably not. But the rabbis had to square the reality of King David coming from this marriage between an Israelite and a Moabite woman with what they felt to be the law. And how could King David come from an illegal relationship? Are there any other people included in this prohibition? So the Canaanites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians and Edomites, only up to 3 generations. No, it doesn't seem like the exclusion in the Bible applies to all people. What's the exception that's specifically mentioned? In the Bible, in Deuteronomy chapter 21, it talks about if there is war. And as part of the war, you go and you capture women, and you see a beautiful woman, and you want to take her as a wife. You can take her as a wife. Presumably, she's not a Canaanite. What do the rabbis do? Well, they say, she has to convert to Judaism. But in the Bible, they read it back into the Bible. And we'll see when we get to conversion next week, we'll see what the rabbis do with biblical passages. But historically, as far as I'm concerned, what we consider conversion to Judaism doesn't exist in the Bible. So here is a kind of marriage to a non-Israelite that seems to be permitted. All right, let me pause and see if there are any questions, because I've covered a big chunk of material. Any questions? All right, so now we're going to go centuries later. The Israelites have been, most of them have been exiled from their land to Babylonia. And to make a long story short, after Babylonia is conquered by the Persians under King Cyrus permits them to go back to their land, to reestablish a community in and around Jerusalem, and rebuild the destroyed temple. Now this people are no longer called really Israelites, but we could call them Judeans, people who live in Judea, or let's call them now Jews. But there's a problem that is recorded in the book of Ezra. Ezra is one of the leaders of this new community that has come back to the land of Israel. Most of the people, by the way, stayed in Babylonia, in present-day Iraq. Only a minority came back to reestablish a community around the 5th, 4th century before the Common Era. What's the problem? The Israelites or Judeans are marrying foreign women. So let's look at the second source. Dominica, if you could just raise it a little so we could just have the English and the Hebrew. Thank you. Perfect. So the people of Israel and the priests and Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the land whose abhorrent practices are like those of the Canaanites. What's the problem? They're idolaters. These aren't Canaanites. They're long gone. These are other people, but they're also pagans. They don't worship the one God. They worship many deities. And what have they done? They have taken their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons. All right. Notice it doesn't say anything about Judean or Jewish woman marrying non non-Jewish men. They're gone. They're a lost cause, because it would seem that Ezra, like the other books in the Bible, believes that it's the man that determines the identity of the child. So that their holy seed has become intermingled with the peoples of the land. And worse yet, it is the officers and prefects, meaning the leaders of the people, who have taken the lead in this trespass. The leaders are marrying the people of the land who are non-Jews. And it's the same danger as in the book of Deuteronomy. They will be led astray and worship idols and not worship the God of Israel. So what Ezra, the book of Ezra, does is expand the prohibition, which only seems to be on the 7 Canaanite nations and the Moabites and Ammonites, into any non-Israelite people who are all pagans. It expands it, we would say, to a general ban on intermarriage. But I think my reading of this text is that what we have here is still patrilineal descent. It's the man who determines the religious/national identity of the child. Some people in modern times wanted to take this passage as the origin of the principle, which we'll come to in later times, of matrilineal descent. That is the traditional later Jewish definition that it's the woman that determines the child. But I don't think that's the case here. I think it's still the man, but Ezra is against them marrying non-Israelite or non-Jewish women. All right. So what does he want? Let's look at the next section. Dominica, if you could, thank you. Then Ezra the priest, he's the religious leader of the people, got up and said to them, "You have trespassed by bringing home foreign women, thus aggravating the guilt of Israel. So now make confession to the Lord, the God of your fathers, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the people of the land and from foreign women." Basically, what he asked them to do is to get rid of their foreign wives. And not only that, as this passage goes on, he also asked them to get rid of the children born to these women. Now, that's quite a request. Kick out your wives and kick out your children. Did they do that? Probably not, but we don't know. The Bible doesn't say. The next book in the Bible originally was all one book, which is called Nehemiah, who was the Persian appointed governor of Judea, also talks about the problem of intermarriage. and that the Judeans are marrying foreign women. So it doesn't seem like the problem went away. Despite Ezra's plea, despite Ezra's decree, the problem remains. So again, the problem throughout the biblical period is that the Israelites marry non-Israelites, and the religious concern is that they will be led astray from the Israelite religion and worship not the God of Israel, but other deities, and that what determines the child's identity is the man, or patriarchal descent, not matriarchal descent. Why? Because the idea is when the woman joins the husband's household, she basically adopts his religion and his nationality, even though there's no formal ceremony. That is, in brief, the biblical take. So let's move the text away. Let me look at your faces. All right, and see if anybody has any questions or comments.
I have one question, but I think it's too early for this question. So,
well, ask anyway. If it's too early, I will tell you if it's too early. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I'm just wondering, how come we switched from this patriarchal to matriarchal?
I will come to that. Thank you for your question, but I will give you 8 different theories about it. 7 or 8 different theories. So you can pick and choose, because the truth of the matter is there is no definitive answer.
Mm-hmm. But do we know
when?
Do we know when it happened?
Yes, roughly. Yes. We'll come to that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, terrific question. Anybody else? All right, so let's move on to the next period, the Second Temple period. So if you could put those sources up, please, Dominica. Yeah, thank you. So the period we're talking about now is, for our purposes, roughly from 200 BCE, 200 before the Common Era, to 70 CE, the year of the destruction of the Second Temple. That's the Second Temple period is longer than that, but we're going to be looking at first non-rabbinic sources. Sources mainly from Greek-speaking Jews. At this time, a large number of Jews lived in Egypt, where their primary language was Greek. They lived in what is today Syria and Turkey, and even in Greece itself, and they spoke and wrote in Greek. The Bible, the first translation of the Bible, the Septuagint, is of the Hebrew Bible is into Greek. So let's look at a man named Philo, who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, which had a huge Jewish community. There's a story, I don't know if it's true, it might be made up, that the main synagogue in Alexandria was so huge, and they didn't have, of course, loudspeakers or anything like that, that for people at the end of the synagogue to hear when a prayer was made so they could say amen, they couldn't hear it. So somebody in the front of the synagogue waved flags, like from a ship, to let them know that it was time to say Amen. A huge Jewish community in Alexandria. One of the leaders of that community was a Jewish philosopher named Philo, who attempted to explain Judaism in terms of Greek philosophy. And he wrote a commentary on the Torah, as well as many other books. And let's look what he says about marrying outside of Judaism. But also Moses says, do not enter into the partnership of marriage with a member of a foreign national, lest someday, conquered by the forces of opposing custom, you surrender and go astray. And though you yourself will hold your ground, there is much to be feared for your sons and daughters. It may well be that they are enticed by spurious customs, which they prefer to the genuine, and are unlikely to unlearn the honor due to the one God. So basically, he is basing the prohibition on marrying outside of Judaism on the same rationale that the Torah does in Deuteronomy. You will be led astray from Judaism. And like Ezra, he says it applies to all non-Jews, not just the Canaanites who no longer exist. I didn't bring it because I didn't want to burden you with too many sources, but the same thing is said by another Jew who writes in Greek in the 1st century, the famous Jewish historian Josephus Flavius. He says the same thing as Philo. Now, the other thing to point out, again, this is the 1st century of the Common Era, neither of them seem to know anything about a matrilineal principle. For them, it's patrilineal. I now want to go to a different kind of Jew. I want to go to the New Testament, to a passage in the book of the New Testament called Acts, or Acts of the Apostles. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, perfect. It was probably written, according to scholars, somewhere between 90 and 110 CE. And this particular passage is talking about the activity of Paul, also known by his Hebrew name, Shaul, Saul, who was one of the early Jewish followers of Jesus, and is the one, more than anybody else, who really gave birth to Christianity as a separate religion coming out of Judaism by preaching the idea that Jesus is the Messiah, and the ideas found in the teachings of Jesus to the non-Jewish world. Paul lived in largely in Antioch, which is on the border between Syria and Turkey, and he preached in what is today Turkey and Greece. So from there, let me read the passage. From there, he went to Derbe and then on to Lystra. Here, there was a disciple called Timothy, whose mother was a Jew who would become a believer, meaning a believer in Jesus. But his father was Greek. The brothers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of Timothy, and Paul, who wanted to have him as a traveling companion, had him circumcised. This was on account of the Jews in the locality where everyone knew his father was Greek. Now, what does this passage mean? Paul likes this guy, Timothy, who's a believer in Jesus. And Paul wants him as his traveling assistant when he goes to preach. And by the way, Paul, I don't know if anybody is in marketing in the business world, but Paul was a marketing genius. So Paul, when he went, everywhere he went in what is today Turkey and Greece, he went where there were Jewish communities. Why? Because he knew there were non-Jews there who might be interested in his message. There are a group of people that the New Testament refers to as God-fearers, who were, for want of a better word, hanging out at synagogues. They were curious about Judaism. They hadn't converted to Judaism because maybe conversion existed then, maybe it didn't. We'll get into that next week. So he knew that we would have a receptive audience. So he's going around with this guy, Timothy, whose mother is Jewish and his father is not Jewish. Now, it seems to me that if Paul and the Jews of this time believed in the matrilineal principle, he wouldn't have to do anything. You know, you're Jewish, whether you're circumcised or not. You need to be circumcised, of course, but you don't lose your Jewishness if you're not circumcised. It could only be that Paul and the Jews in these communities thought of this guy as not Jewish because his father was Greek. And that's why Paul had him circumcised. All right, everybody follow? All right, so these texts show, all right, but let's remove the text so I can see people's faces again and see if there are questions. These texts show, one, that there was a ban or a prohibition from these authors on marriage between Jews and non-Jews. That included all non-Jews. And two, it appears that the non-rabbinic sources in this period did not believe in the matrilineal principle, but believed in the patrilineal principle. All right, so this takes us up to about the year 100 CE. Questions or comments? We're good? All right, so if I gave you a quiz on this, you would all get excellent. All right.
Hopefully.
So let's, what? No.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, all right. But the good news about this class is there are no quizzes and everybody automatically gets excellent. So, and the good news for me is I don't have to grade any papers or tests because I just finished doing that. So I had enough, thank you. So now we're gonna look at what the rabbis have to say about this. And then we're gonna look, time permitting, about what happens to the matrilineal principle in the modern period. So Dominica, if you could put those sources up. Now, I want to mention, first of all, the rabbinic period. When I'm talking about classical rabbinic Judaism, we're talking about roughly from the year 70 of the Common Era to the year 600. There were many different kinds of Judaism in this period. It took quite a while for the rabbis to, after the destruction of the Second Temple, for the rabbis to establish themselves as the dominant form of Judaism, which the vast majority of Jews follow. Now, for the rabbis, writing in this period, whatever the reality was, intermarriage was not a serious problem for them. They don't deal with it a lot. It doesn't seem to have been a major concern for them. Whether it certainly existed, Jews were marrying non-Jews, but at least for the rabbis, as reflected in their writings, it's not a problem. So here's the major passage that, couple of the major passages that deal with it. The first one attempts to deal with the passage we looked at before from the book of Deuteronomy that prohibits marriage with Canaanites. And this is during a discussion of what is the basis for prohibiting marriages between Jews and all non-Jews, not just Canaanites. Is it based on the passage in Deuteronomy, or is there another source that it could be based on? So the prohibition against marrying their daughters is a biblical ordinance. For it is written, neither shall you make marriages with them. But the biblical law is restricted to the 7 Canaanite nations and does not include other Gentile nations. Right? They're saying no. They're reading that verse as I read it. At least this particular section is reading it that way. It only applies to the Canaanites. It's not a blanket prohibition against all non-Jews. So they want to find a basis for it. What's the basis? There was a rabbinic decree going earlier to the 1st century BCE to the 2 great schools of Hillel and Shammai, who decreed against a blanket prohibition against marrying any kind of non-Jew. But it's not based on the Torah, it's based on a rabbinic prohibition. But that's not good enough for them. Again, I shorten this passage. There's the passage goes on to say, no, it's even earlier. It goes back to the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, the heroes of the Hanukkah story, who established a Jewish kingdom after they defeated the Syrian Greeks in 166 BCE. That lasted for about 100 years. They prohibited not only marriage to non-Jews, but even sexual relationships out of marriage with non-Jews. So it goes back even earlier. The prohibition against marriage to all non-Jews. Now, it's interesting that except for one passage in the Talmud, which again, for purposes of brevity, I didn't bring, the Talmud doesn't try and trace the prohibition against intermarriage with any kind of non-Jew back to the Torah. There's one passage that does, that uses Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. But all the other passages don't. All right, so that's the rabbis on interfaith or marriage with non-Jews. All right, now we're going to get to the matrilineal principle, the idea that that it is the mother and not the father that determines who is a Jew. And we're going to see that the rabbis do acrobatics to try and derive this from the Torah. First of all, here is, I would say, one half of the matrilineal principle, the source number 2. So if you could raise the screen a little, thank you. Number 2 from the Mishnah. In the case of any woman whose betrothal, and by that they mean marriage, with him is invalid, and where betrothal with others would be invalid, the offspring follows her own status, meaning she cannot legally marry the person by whom she has a child, nor can she legally contract marriage to anybody according to Jewish law. Who is that? All right. The offspring of a male Jew and a non-Jewish slave or a non-Jewish woman. So if he has sexual relationships with her and they have a child, the child follows the mother. Everybody follow? Why? It doesn't really say. This is somebody, again, who cannot legally contract a marriage because she's not a Jew under Jewish law. But that's only half of the matrilineal principle. All right. What about a Jewish woman and a non-Jewish man? For whatever reason, the Mishnah does not deal with that. So the Mishnah here is missing the case of a Gentile man and a Jewish woman, right? What happens to that child? What is the status of that child? There is a big debate in rabbinic sources over this. And it takes a couple of centuries before what I call the second half of the matrilineal principle gets settled. That is a Jewish man, non-Jewish man and a Jewish woman. One, and we'll look at this in a minute in greater detail, but one view is that such a child, meaning a child of a non-Jewish man and a Jewish woman, is what's called a mamzer. That requires some explanation. A mamzer is usually translated as a bastard, an illegitimate child, but that is not a good translation. A mamzer is a child that is born from two Jews who are not married, is not illegitimate in Jewish law. It has no legal disabilities, no special status. It's not encouraged, but the child has no legal problem. It's a mamzer is a child born from an illicit sexual union, such as, for example, an incestuous union. That child is a mamzer. Or according to strict Jewish law, if somebody, a Jewish man marries a Jewish woman, and according to Jewish law, and they get a civil divorce, but they don't get a religious divorce called a get, and that woman goes on and marries another Jewish man, that child is a mamzer. And that is a very severe legal disability because according to strict Jewish law, that child cannot marry anybody except another mamzer or a convert to Judaism. This is not just some arcane legal problem, because it was particularly a big problem after World War II. There were women who thought their husbands had died in the Holocaust, got remarried, had a child or children, and then all of a sudden the husband showed up, whom she thought was dead. What to do with these children? There's some famous cases in Israel where this occurred. Often the rabbis tried to find a way out so the child wouldn't be a mamzer. The Reform movement doesn't have this status. The conservative movement attempted to get rid of it also, so only the Orthodox really have it. So that was one view. But we're going to see, fortunately, that view did not win out. All right, so let's look at source number 3. Okay. How do we know that the non-Jewish woman, her child, has her status? All right. Rabbi Yochanan said on the authority of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Scripture says, "For he will turn away your son from following me." Your son from a Jewish woman is called your son. But your son, it should say, by a Gentile woman, is not called your son. Rabina said, this proves that your daughter's son by a Gentile is called your son. This is a very convoluted and hard to understand derivation. And the later interpreters of the Talmud in the Middle Ages, again, have to do all kinds of acrobatics to understand this. How do they get that from this verse? It's not so apparent. And Ravina, by the way, is already relatively late. He's in the 4th century when the second half of the matrilineal principle, what happens to the child of a non-Jewish man and a Jewish woman, is decided. Remember, there are other opinions. One is that the child is a mamzer, which we're going to look at. I'm not going to go into more details about this unless I see we have time, just because it's so complicated. What I want you to get out of it is that this is the opinion that becomes Jewish law, that the child of a non-Jewish man and a Jewish woman becomes Jewish. Number 4, we move to that. All right. A Gentile, this is another statement of the matrilineal principle. A Gentile or a slave who had sexual relations with a Jewish woman and she had a son, this is the opinion I quoted before, the offspring is a mamzer. But fortunately, as I said before, this does not become the law. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says, in the name of Rabbi Shimon, a mamzer derives only from a woman who is prohibited by reason of scriptural statements on prohibited sexual unions, on account of whom they're liable to extirpation. I don't want to worry about what that last part means, correct. But it is this view that persists. That child is not a mamzer, but a Jew. All right. So we've had, can we move up a little to the next source? So we've had two opinions, only one opinion about the status of so far about a status of a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman. So far, everybody says that that child is a non-Jew. So far, we're going to see there is a dissenting opinion. We've had two opinions about a Jewish woman and a non-Jewish man. One, that child is a mamzer, which still makes that child a Jew, but it has a legal disability. And the other is that child is a Jew, pure and simple. That's the matriarchal principle. So here comes our dissenting view, source number 5. All right. I'm sorry, let me just interrupt myself. There is one view, just again, another minority view in the Talmud that says that that a Gentile man and a Jewish woman, that the child is a Gentile. The patriarchal principle. That's found in some rabbinic texts, but again, a minority point of view, and that is not the view that wins out. So let's go to our dissenting view about a Gentile woman and a Jewish man. Rabbi Jacob of Kfar Niburiah ruled in Tyre. Tyre is today in Lebanon. Was a Jewish community there for centuries. It is permitted to circumcise the infant son of a Gentile woman and, in parentheses, a Jewish man on the Sabbath. Well, what does this mean? There are all kinds of prohibitions on the Sabbath, but when it comes to a Brit Milah, when it comes to circumcision, you can override those prohibitions for the sake of performing a Brit Milah. It's such an important commandment. Now, if this fellow Jacob is saying that you can do it on the Sabbath, that you can perform a Brit Milah for the child of a Gentile woman and a Jewish man, he clearly considers this offspring Jewish. Along comes his friend, Rabbi Haggai, and says to him, come and be whipped. All right, this is not a nice thing to say to somebody, right? You are deserving of being whipped. Jacob says to Rabbi Haggai, what are you talking about? I have a basis in the Torah for this. And Rabbi Haggai says to him, what's the basis in the Torah? How is this scriptural? Because it is written, and they declared their pedigrees after their families by their fathers' houses. In other words, patrilineal descent. Rabbi Haggai says back to him, you have not ruled well. Jacob says back to him, and how can you prove this to me? He says, lie down, meaning get prepared to be whipped, and I will prove it to you. It is written, now therefore, let us make a covenant with our God to put away all the wives and such as are born of them. That's the passage we saw before from Ezra, that he wants to use to show that children born of non-Jewish women are non-Jews. All right. Now, Jacob, though, has a problem with that. What's the problem? That's not in the Torah. The way the books in other parts of the Hebrew Bible, in the prophets and writings, like Ezra, don't carry as much weight in the Torah. So he says, I'm not buying your argument because you're quoting something not on the basis of the Torah, but other books in the Bible. It's not good enough. So then Haggai says, and there's something left out in this text, let it be done according to the Torah. Parallel texts elsewhere in rabbinic literature, the parallel story quotes from our old friend Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 and 4 about the Canaanites and not marrying them and not giving your son to them. Now, Jacob accepts this ruling. He says, okay, I'm wrong. You were right. Hit me for it is well taught, meaning I accept your argument. But it's interesting that here again, we have a dissenting opinion. All right, so let's remove the text and let me see people's faces again. So to summarize, the dominant view becomes if a Jewish man has a child with a non-Jewish woman, that child is a non-Jew. And if a non-Jewish woman, a Jewish woman has a child with a non-Jewish man, that child is a Jew. But there, as we've seen, there are dissenting opinions. And to answer Alexander's question, the earliest evidence we have for the matrilineal principle is the 2nd century of the Common Era. No earlier than that. Now, the big question is why? Why? Why this change from patrilineal to matrilineal? And not only that, it seems even stranger when you consider that this is very much a patriarchal society, right? The Talmud says, over and over again in a variety of ways, it all depends on the man. It all depends on the man's family. Not only that, for other purposes, it is the man that determines the status of a child. For example, whether a child is a Kohen, a Levi, or an Israelite, the 3 traditional divisions among the Jewish people, is determined by the father, not the mother. So why the difference here? So I'm going to give you, depending on how you want to count, 6 or 7 different theories. All right. And I don't know which one is correct. I don't know if any of them is correct. And there is no way to determine why this happened authoritatively. One is the rabbis just felt bound by their interpretation of scripture. That's how they saw Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. That it led them to that conclusion about matrilineal descent. Number 2, it actually goes back earlier. I reject, this is one theory I reject, to the time of Ezra, right? I explained earlier why I reject that theory. It could be Rabbi, Haggai, we saw, wanted to base it on Ezra. I don't think Ezra had a matrilineal principle, but certainly there were some rabbis that wanted to base it on that. Third, and this is the one you'll probably hear the most often, right? The uncertainty of the paternity of a child. You always know who the mother is. But the argument against that is the rabbis didn't apply it to other cases, right? So, for example, if a woman is, God forbid, raped, and you don't know who the father is, the status of the child, the Talmud says, follows the majority of people in the area, whatever that is. The rabbis didn't invoke the matrilineal principle there. If the reason was because you always know who the woman is, let the status follow the woman. 3, the special bonds of the intimacy of motherhood. Or 3 or 4, depending on how you want to count these, sorry. 5, a parallel to Roman law. We know that the rabbis in some areas of the law were aware of and influenced by Roman law from their period. According to Roman law, if a Roman man marries a non-citizen woman, that child is a non-citizen. All right, you see the parallel? However, here's where the parallel breaks down. If a Roman woman marries a non-citizen man, the status follows the man. That is not in parallel with Jewish law exactly. But it does fit the view that in such a case, in Jewish law, the child would be a mamzer. So parallel to Roman law. 7, due to historical circumstances, right? In the Jews fought 2 rebellions against the Romans that were devastating in terms of the loss of life, particularly of men, because it was the men who were mainly the fighters. The first revolt occurred from 66 to 70 CE, and the second from 132 to 135. This resulted in a shortage of Jewish men and too many Jewish women. So the rabbis wanted to discourage intermarriage by making the child born to a non-Jewish woman a non-Jew. It's purely speculative. There's no evidence for this. There's no textual evidence for this. It's just another theory. Final theory, we're going to have to now resort to text. Okay, so could you put up the last text, please? So this has to do with the rabbis' views of forbidden mixtures. Which, for example, if there are laws in the Torah about which animals can plow together, right? You can't do an ox and a smaller animal plowing your field together. Why? Because it's cruel to the smaller animal, because the smaller animal, if it's bound together with the ox, it can't do as much work. It's cruel to the smaller animal. So what about something that is the offspring of 2 different animals, right? A horse and a donkey produces a mule. What is the status of a mule? It depends who the mother is, not who the father is. Similarly, let's look at this text, number 6. Now, these are all theoretical, all right? And doesn't mean that this is, the rabbis like theoretical cases. It doesn't mean this could happen, right? If a kosher animal gave birth to a non-kosher animal of source, let's say, I don't think this is possible, a male horse mated with a cow and produced an animal. Cow is kosher. The offspring would be kosher. If a non-kosher animal gave birth to a kosher animal of sorts, it is not permitted for food. So if, to take the same two animals, if an ox mated with a female, if an ox mated with a female horse, the offspring would not be kosher because the horse is not kosher. All right, suspend your disbelief. I don't think this is biologically possible, but the principle here is that the offspring follows the mother. This is because that which emerges from a non-kosher animal is non-kosher, and that which emerges from the kosher animal is kosher. What this means is the rabbinic view of matrilineality flows organically from rabbinic thought about mixtures. Now, before you say this is ridiculous, what relevance is this? I want to point out to you one thing, that, for example, Philo and other non-rabbinic sources from the Second Temple period compare mixed marriages to mixed breeding of species. So, all right, let's remove the text. So what do you think? Which theory do you like?
I think they are all interesting. What I found interesting is that, if I count correctly, it seems that more theories have some kind of practical reason behind them than religious / I don't know, theological aspect behind them. Is that correct? Do you agree with this?
Let me hear. Yeah, you're right. There are practical reasons parallel to Roman law, and some I didn't even bring this in because it's too much. There's parallels in Greek law, and then there is sort of what I call that this comes organically out of rabbinic thought. So those, if to broadly classify the reasons, those are the reasons. But you know, nobody knows. And even if you look at Orthodox sources down to the modern period, and I haven't looked at every source, but they say things like, we don't know why this is.
And when it comes to this last quote from Mishnah about those animals of different species breeding together, I think, I mean, I'm not an expert in biology. I know something about biology, but it seems it's not very biologically plausible, actually, to have something like this. If I'm correct, you know, about kashrut and biology, I'm not sure if I am.
No, I think I'm no biologist, but I think you're correct. Except, you know, a horse and a donkey produce a mule, right? That is true.
So that will be probably the reference, like the actual physical reference.
That's the actual cases. The other cases, when it comes to kashrut, that those I think are very far-fetched, you know.
So there would be some actual, let's say, a physical reality behind this citation that you presented, but the
Right.
interpretation would be like more like trying to abstract from this and
Yes.
build an abstract rule. And
Very well put. Are you a scientist by profession?
well, sort of, yeah.
Okay. Don't be modest. It's okay. If you are, you are. Right? It's an honorable profession, right?
Yes, I mean, I'm certainly. I'm not necessarily an academic scientist by profession. But I'm kind of. I'm using scientific method in my job. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So, I personally think it's an organic evolution out of Jewish thought. Why? The rabbis, I don't know how to put this in polite terms. The rabbis are obsessed with mixtures and things that are on the margins. For example, I really don't want to get into this because it's very strange stuff. There is a lot in rabbinic literature about the status of androgynous human beings and hermaphrodites, people that have both sexual organs. How common were these things? Probably not very common, but you wouldn't know it from reading rabbinic literature where there is a lot of material on this. The rabbis are very interested intellectually in these marginal cases and in cases of mixtures. Now, why that is a whole theological discussion I don't want to get into. So I lean towards that explanation. But there's nothing authoritative in any of them. So take your pick. A lot of people prefer the practical explanation.
Yeah.
All right. Any more questions before we move on to modern material? All right. So what happens in the modern period is that there are challenges to the matrilineal principle, particularly in America, already in the 19th century, already in the 1800s, when there are not that many Jews in the United States. They're marrying non-Jews. And already we know that American Reform rabbis, and please understand, before the 1800s, they're not all the different denominations in Judaism we have today, Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. Everybody is a traditional Jew. Or even if they're not observant, what they're rebelling against is traditional Judaism. The other kind of adjectival Judaisms don't exist until the 1800s. So America in the 1800s, there are not many Jews. There are not many rabbis by the middle of the 1800s. There's not a rabbinical school in America till the late 1800s. It's wide open here. So American Reform rabbis have people who are married to non-Jews, not many, but some, where there's a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother. They incorporate them into their congregations and into their religious schools, without saying much about it. Let's skip 100 years or so. In 1947, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the Central American Reform Rabbinical Association, says that if a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother raise their children as Jewish, the declaration of their parents to raise them as Jews is enough to for the children to be considered as if they converted to Judaism without any ritual or ceremony. That's already 1947. when there are not many intermarriages. Probably at that time in America, my guess would be less than 5% of Jews married outside the faith. Just a personal anecdote. I had an uncle, my mother's brother, who married a non-Jew in the early 1950s. This was almost unheard of. It was so rare. But that's a long time ago, right? Before most of you were born, I suspect. All right. I'm not going to ask Merrick his age. In 1961, in the American Reform Rabbi's Manual, it said, if a child is born of such a union, a Jewish father, non-Jewish mother, and they attend religious school and they go through confirmation, they should be accepted as Jews. But this wasn't a formal resolution. It was just something they put into the rabbi's manual. 1970s and 1980s in America, there's a tremendous growth in the rate of interfaith marriage. This is really when it starts happening in America, 1970s, 1980s. In 1983, the reform movement in America passes a resolution that says the child of one Jewish parent, I'm quoting from it now, is under, just one Jewish parent, is under the presumption of Jewish descent if it is raised with appropriate Jewish life cycle events, public and formal acts of identification, circumcision, baby naming, bar and bat mitzvah, confirmation. Acts of identification with the Jewish faith and the Jewish people. So this is sometimes called patrilineal descent, but that is really a misname for this because it is equilineal, meaning if the father or the mother is Jewish and raised Jewish, whatever that means, and we'll talk about that in a minute, then the child is considered Jewish. This was passed in 1983, and I sent out, and I'm not going to go through it. It's long, but if anybody wants it, Dominica has it, or I have it. I have the legal opinion, the responsum, using Jewish sources written by the Reform movement to validate this decision. If anybody wants it, I or Dominica can send it to you. There are many problems with it. And the Reconstructionist movement, a smaller movement in America, also accepts unilineal descent. The conservative and Orthodox do not. Now, there are a bunch of problems with this. Obviously, this was done in reaction to problems, to a reality that a lot of Jewish men were marrying non-Jewish women, and to attempt to keep their children within the boundaries of the Jewish people and Jewish religion. Meaning the motives, I think, were good, even though I disagree with it as a conservative rabbi. Now, first problem. This opinion was not accepted by all regions of the Reform movement. In Israel, the Reform movement did not accept this opinion. It still holds to the traditional matrilineal principle. In Canada, Reform rabbis did not accept this view. In Europe, I think it depends. I was told by Rabbi Beliak that it depends on the country. I'm going to write somebody to get an update on this, but that's what he told me. So the Reform movement is not united in this view. That's problem number one. Number two, what does it mean to raise a child as Jewish? And by the way, there's a real irony here. Technically speaking, according to this definition, if somebody had a Jewish mother but never had a Jewish education, according to the Orthodox and conservative movement, right, they would be considered Jewish. According to the Reform movement, no. You have to perform acts of identification and life cycle ceremonies, or you don't count. Now, is this enforced? I don't think so in the Reform movement in America, but that's what it says. What are the acts of identification? What do you have to do? How many years of Jewish education? Do you have to have a bar and bat mitzvah? It's never been 100% decided. There was a task force in 1996 that was supposed to deal with it. I was unable to get a hold of that document. I don't know what they came up with. So it's kind of remains kind of ill defined. Other problems. It's created separate sets of who is a Jew for between the Reform and the conservative and Orthodox movements. Now, I will tell you, having had to deal with this as a rabbi, this is very difficult, where a child has been raised in the Reform movement, right? Thinks of his or herself as Jewish their whole life, comes and wants to marry somebody who's a conservative Jew, and finds out because their mother is not Jewish and they've never been converted, they can't marry this person they're in love with. This is very difficult to deal with, and I've dealt with a number of such cases. It's very painful for this person who identifies as a Jew to find this out. It's very hard for me as a rabbi to have to tell this person who's lived their whole life living as a Jew, thinking they're a Jew, to tell them, according to me, they're not Jewish. It has to be handled with a lot of sensitivity. But this is happening. Another problem. This decision has served to discourage conversion in the Reform movement, particularly of the non-Jewish female partner. It's obvious to me that a Jew and a non-Jew, I know this from personal experience, can raise their child with a strong Jewish identity, but it certainly helps if both parents share the same identity in terms of inculcating Jewish values and respect for Jewish tradition. So it's a disincentive to conversion. Finally, and this is more on the theological level, it turns Judaism clearly into a matter of choice and identification and not of birth. Now, some people may think that's a good thing. It turns Judaism into a matter of volition and not birth, and requires affirmation of Jewish identity. Again, some people may think that's a good thing. I don't. It certainly doesn't fit the traditional definition of Judaism, which is not volitional. It is something you're born into or convert into. In the traditional view of things, God chooses the Jews. In this view of thing, the Jew chooses God. So those are some of my problems with it. You are free to disagree with me. There is a lot more that could be said about this decision, which continues to reverberate throughout the Jewish world. All right, questions or comments? Don't be shy. You can still get a good grade from me if you disagree with me.
So I was wondering, you said that you disagree with this volitional aspect, right? But it's still like in reform movement is not it's not always the same, right? So depending on the country, as you said, or maybe
for the reform movement, for the conservative movement. By the way, there was a movement there's been a movement within conservative Judaism again in America because of the huge number of interfaith marriages to consider patrilineal descent or equal lineal descent, but that has been rejected. As I think many of you know, the reform movement, at least in America, permits rabbis to perform interfaith marriages. The conservative movement and Orthodox movements do not. So the conservative movements, Orthodox movements on these issues are the same all over the world. The reform movement differs from country to country.
So in the reform movement, it will be still possible for a conservative Jew and reform Jew to get married, but not in the conservative movement, right?
It's not that the person is a reform Jew. It's if their mother is not, just to be precise, if their mother is not Jewish, even though they've been raised Jewish.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Wow, I'm finishing exactly on time. That's a miracle. If you don't believe in miracles, you just witnessed one.